Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Froman. I'm president of the council, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here for the launch of our Climate Realism Initiative. This is an important endeavor that was born out of an effort to elevate a pragmatic U.S. foreign policy agenda around climate change while also advancing American competitiveness in global clean technologies and U.S. leadership on the clean energy transition. We're delighted to have a full house here in person, plus another 100 or so people online. The council launched a number of strategic initiatives over the last year or so. Real Econ, which is reimagining American economic leadership, led by Matt Goodman. Our China Strategy Initiative, led by Rush Doshi. And then today we're delighted that Varun Sivaram has returned. He's a recidivist here, back at the council as a senior fellow for energy and climate to launch the Climate Realism Initiative. Because wherever you stand on the policy issues around climate change, there are a host of climate impacts that are already being felt at home and around the world. And there's an increasing centrality of clean energy technologies in international trade and great power competition. There's a need to forge a bipartisan, pragmatic, fact-based approach to mobilizing the technology and finance necessary to deal with these challenges, and that's what climate realism is all about. This initiative will pursue three projects: navigating the geopolitics of risks of a warming world, accelerating clean technology innovation and U.S. competitiveness, and averting catastrophic climate change. And none of us can deal with all of these issues alone. It's going to require bringing people together from different sectors, public, private, academic, different parts of the country, and different political perspectives. And that's where the council really excels, as being here for over 100 years as a nonpartisan institution that brings together people from multiple sectors all across the country and does so in a fact-based research agenda. We've got a great day in store for you today with panels that touch on these various issues. We've got an array of great speakers. I won't name them all, but I see my my former colleague, Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz, and we're delighted to have him join us as well. As a reminder, today's discussions are on the record. We're deeply grateful to the Sequoia and Climate Works Foundations for their support of this launch, as well as Dan Poneman and Susan and David Rockefeller Jr. for their support of climate realism more broadly. And with that, we'll turn it over to a launch video, and then Varun Sivaram will come up and continue the discussion. Thanks very much for being here. Climate change will be one of the chief factors shaping the 21st century. Every country will feel its effects. Extreme weather events and the rise in global temperatures and sea levels in recent years are just a harbinger of the consequences we could face this century and beyond. Yet global efforts to confront this threat have been profoundly inadequate. The landmark 2015 Paris Agreement to limit the rise in global temperatures is having too little impact on the world's ever-increasing CO2 emissions. At the same time, the global clean energy transition has emerged both as a vast new economic frontier and as a pivotal geopolitical battleground. The race to become the energy leader of the future is well underway, freighted with both opportunity and risk for the United States. For over a century, the Council on Foreign Relations has shaped the U.S. foreign policy debate on the issues critical to American interests. In this century, climate change and energy must be recognized as among those issues. That's why we're launching the Climate Realism Initiative, one of the Council's 4 strategic initiatives alongside our work on China, U.S. economic leadership, and technology. To tell you more, here's the initiative's director, Varun Sivaram.
The Climate Realism Initiative begins by acknowledging some tough realities. Accelerating climate change poses a grave national security risk to the American homeland, every bit as serious as all-out war. For example, warming oceans and droughts contribute to more intense hurricanes and wildfires, compounding the risks to vulnerable areas with rapid economic development. Just in the last decade, natural disasters have killed thousands of Americans and inflicted more than $1 trillion of economic damage. These threats will only intensify as the world blows through its climate target of limiting global warming to at most 2 degrees Celsius. It's instead on track for 3 degrees or more by the century's end. within the lifetime of a child born today, major American cities could be uninhabitable, pummeled by disasters, or submerged below sea level rise of 7 feet. However, America and its advanced economy allies will produce a dwindling share of future emissions, so cuts at home are insufficient. The vast majority of future emissions will come from China and emerging economies like India. Yet those countries will act in their own self-interest. They're unlikely to compromise their economic development if fossil fuels remain more attractive than the alternatives. To be sure, clean energy is gaining traction and represents a massive global market opportunity. But the energy transition also poses serious risks to US national interests. So far, China dominates industries spanning solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles. As the world's largest producer of oil and gas, the United States could lose geopolitical leverage and economic vitality without building globally competitive clean technology industries as well. From this clear-eyed starting point, the Climate Realism Initiative will pursue 3 projects to shape a foreign policy that pragmatically advances American interests. First, navigating the geopolitics and risks of a warming world will shape preparations for a hotter world that's missed its climate targets. America will need to build resilience at home, navigate new theaters of great power competition, such as the melting Arctic, and equip foreign policymakers to confront global mass migration and humanitarian disasters. Second, accelerating clean technology innovation and US competitiveness aims to scale emerging technologies, such as next-generation batteries, or clean power systems to supply AI's surging demand, as well as navigate trade-offs among building globally competitive clean technology industries, safeguarding US energy security, and advancing the global energy transition. And third, averting catastrophic climate change will explore levers of American influence that can meaningfully reduce the risk of breaching critical planetary tipping points. That's whether assisting or compelling emerging economies to curtail their emissions, to exploring the pros and cons of steps to directly alter the trajectory of climate change through the application of technologies such as geoengineering. CFR's Climate Realism Initiative offers a fresh and pragmatic approach to climate change.
Through this initiative, CFR will help shape how American leadership through innovation, private sector investment, and targeted international cooperation can advance resilience and competitiveness and avoid the worst consequences of our climate future. In the months and years ahead, we hope you'll engage with us on this effort.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. First and foremost, I am so deeply grateful to Mike Froman for giving me a shot to elevate climate realism among CFR's 4 strategic initiatives. We have a world-class team here at CFR. I want to thank my colleagues. Deputy Director Lindsay Iverson is somewhere, as our senior fellows David Hart, Alice Hill, Dan Poneman, our research teams, Mia, Priyanka, Max, and all the departments across CFR, from the digital team that made that video you just saw to the meetings and the communications and the studies team. Thank you so much. And of course, I'm so grateful to, as Mike said, our philanthropic supporters, from foundations like Sequoia and ClimateWorks to generous individuals like Dan Poneman and Susan and David Rockefeller Jr. Thank you. My family is here too. Lakshmi, Uttara, Yogini. So let me strike a personal note. I created Climate Realism because throughout my career, last 15 years in climate and clean energy, I've heard magical fictions that one dare not refute. I've served as a climate diplomat, and all of us have spouted the fictions of a 1.5 degree target or net zero emissions by 2050. These are not useful fictions. They're damaging fictions. They get in the way of America seriously preparing for the disastrous 3-degree future that is our most likely future. So I've also served in C-suites at Fortune 500 clean energy companies and publicly listed ones. I can assure you that in the boardroom, particularly when economic conditions are tough, like right now, shareholder value always trumps sustainability. It's a magical fiction. that climate disclosure rules, voluntary net zero targets, offsets, or virtue signaling will materially advance decarbonization. And finally, as many of you know, I spent multiple years living and working in India on its clean energy industry. I'm passionate about India's economic development and lifting millions out of extreme poverty there and elsewhere. Climate change will ravage emerging economies in developing countries. So it's deeply unfair that the West had a free pass to develop with fossil fuels. But it's a magical fiction that advanced and emerging economies have aligned interests, and that we can negotiate a mutually acceptable deal on climate finance that papers over those disagreements. Once we discard magical fictions, we can get on with the real work of assessing critical trade-offs for American interests. The Climate Realism Initiative welcomes a diversity of opinions. You'll see that from our phenomenal slate of speakers today. They'll take on the toughest, most provocative questions. Our keynote speaker, Secretary Ernie Moniz, is recognized by industry and those on both sides of the aisle as someone who brings realism to fanciful climate proposals. We'll also have 3 panels, which I've ordered in order of least to most speculative. Let's start with what I consider the most certain backdrop, a future where the world misses its climate targets, forcing us to ask how America should prepare for such a shock. Look, today we're looking at a $10 trillion wipeout of market value over the last 3 days, let's say, from the stock market. But just last week, a board member of Allianz posted the following statement, the global insurer. Markets will reprice rapidly and brutally in a 3-degree world. Whole regions will become uninsurable, and when insurance disappears, it's a systemic risk for the entire financial sector. We may see an order of magnitude greater financial wipeout, or 2 orders of magnitude than what we've just seen. After the keynote, we'll move to panel 2 on how the United States can compete with China and others in clean technologies. This is more speculative. We have failed dismally at this so far. But we'll take up whether we already have the tools, the key enablers of American competitiveness through the Inflation Reduction Act, or if we're just on track to spend $1 trillion on existing technologies China has already won, without fundamentally changing our competitive structure through next-generation innovations. And our final panel, panel 3, will be the most speculative of all. How do we avert truly cataclysmic and runaway climate change beyond the 3 degrees of warming we're likely locked into, given America's limited tools, insignificant emissions, and the daunting complexity of either a net zero transition on the one hand, or, as David Keith will tell us, planetary-scale geoengineering on the other? We'll explore questions like, should the United States pursue deep, free, and intensive trade with China and the world to accelerate a global clean energy transition, or should we marshal our trade leverage to pressure China and other emerging economies to decarbonize? We've learned a thing or two about how much trade leverage we have. Finally, let me address the elephant in the room. Climate fell off the radar of the 2024 US electorate, and now the agendas of policymakers in 2025. No, I don't hold the magical fiction naively that by launching climate realism today, we'll immediately elevate climate change and climate to the top of foreign policymakers' radar, particularly given the expanding trade war. But my aspiration, building on Mike's comments, is that over the next 4 years, CFR's Climate Realism Initiative will be the marquee venue to discuss these issues without the partisan branding. You can be realistic about the national security climate threat to the homeland from foreign emissions without being labeled as someone who wants to see the oil and gas industry in the United States shrivel. That could pave the way for climate and energy to one day become a true top foreign policy priority for the United States, just as they're among the 4 strategic initiatives of CFR. So with that, I'm excited to introduce the first panel of today, focused on navigating the geopolitics and risks of a warming world. Let me invite to the stage our 3 speakers. Please come and join me up on stage, and then we'll introduce you. Thanks, everybody. I am just delighted to kick off today's session with a panel focused, again, on what I consider the least speculative of the 3 topics. And we're joined by some expert panelists here. I will say we have a full program today. We'll run from right now all the way through 5 p.m. We'll close with the reception, and we'll have breaks in between each panel for networking. I urge you to stay with us all the way through, because as we go from panel to panel, you will hear things you probably haven't heard before. And that's even considering many of you have spent a lot of time in the climate field. I'm excited to introduce our panel here. To my right, we have David Wallace Wells, opinion writer at the New York Times and a columnist at the New York Times Magazine, and the author of the best-selling Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. When I met David at our recent prep call, I introduced myself as a David Wallace Wells superfan. I think many of you might be as well. To David's right, we have Alice Hill, one of my colleagues and co-conspirators on the Climate Realism Initiative, along with David Hart and Dan Poneman, as well as the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment here at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you.
And finally, we have my dear friend, Sherry Goodman, who has an extraordinary career, formerly at the military under Secretary of Defense, and now the Senior Fellow at the Polar Institute and Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center as well, and a proud CFR member, and most excitingly, the author of the recent book, Threat Multiplier, which, by the way, is a term Sherry invented, Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security, a real stalwart member, founder of the climate and security movement. So these are our 3 fantastic panelists. Let's jump right in. One of the things I want to discuss in the first few minutes is how catastrophic should we really be considering the potential impacts of climate change? There's no one better equipped to answer this than David. And David, I hope you will tell us a little bit about what the median expectation might be, but really what the tail risks are and why we should focus on those tail risks.
Well, first, let me say it's great to be here speaking with you on this occasion, and great to be sharing the stage with both of you. I think when we talk about where we're heading, it's useful to pull back a little bit in time, and I don't want to pull us all the way back to, the Rio Earth Summit, at which point, carbon emissions globally were only about half of what they are today, or Kyoto, or, just a few years back into the past when we were talking about the targets that were agreed to in Paris, and using those targets to frame our understanding of the future to come. 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. And there was an awful lot of research that came out in the second half of the last decade, mapping out exactly what the differences between a world warmed by 1.5 degrees and warmed by 2 degrees would be. Most notably contained in the IPCC report, which came out in the fall of 2018. And that information, when it was shared broadly with the public through the news media in the fall of 2018, was like an earthquake on climate consciousness for almost anyone paying attention. The particulars were horrifying. You may remember a lot of these projections. We might be talking about, just between those 2 thresholds, 150 million additional lives lost to air pollution produced from the burning of fossil fuels. You could see in many parts of the world flooding events that used to hit once a century, hitting every year, in some cases multiple times a year. Many parts of South Asia and the Middle East becoming so hot that during summer it would be a risk to your health to go around outside for long stretches. But more important than that, I would say, is that the world took a look at the big picture produced by that science, which was describing the world of 2 degrees, and said, not universally, but quite broadly, that is terrifying. We need to take action. We need to avoid that future. So much of the climate awakening that you've seen over the last 5 or 8 years, the climate protests, all the way up to prime ministers and presidents and conversations at climate summits, was given an extra urgency by that science. And just to reiterate, that is the science that we have to best describe the world of 2 degrees of warming. So that level of warming really freaked us out about 5 years ago. And now we know almost certainly we are heading north of that level. Now, exactly where that leaves us in terms of the impacts on the landscape, the impact on human livelihoods, is very much an open question, in part because it's not just a scientific question. It's also a policy question about adaptation, which I'm sure we're all going to get into later on in this panel. But one aspect of that future that I think is especially concerning is the one that you mentioned, which is that especially, in my world, speaking to often lay readers, we talk about these futures using anchors that are median projections based on modeled emissions trajectories. And there's a lot of assumptions built into those emissions trajectories, but it's also the case that simply talking about median warming levels is an incredibly narrow way of looking at the risk that we're facing. We may end up in a future with emissions levels at the year 2100 that we are today expecting to produce 2 degrees of warming and still get 3 degrees of warming. We could get emissions levels that we would expect to produce 3 and still get 4.5. There's been an awful lot of good news over the last few years. We do think to some degree the emissions curve is bending, although maybe not as quickly or as dramatically as it seemed it would be the case a couple of years ago, nevertheless heading in the right direction. And yet this whole question of the way we'll be living and how we'll be navigating this future deformed by warming is shadowed by huge amounts of uncertainty that almost no one has had the clarity or really the courage to look squarely at. And these are not vanishing unlikelihoods. It's not 0.0001%, although probably it will be worth looking at those scenarios even if it was just that little. We're talking about, what is the 90th percentile outcome from a certain emissions level? What is in the 80th percentile outcome from a certain emissions level? And those futures are different enough from the median outcomes. I think we've really, really done ourselves a disservice by narrowing the scope of our projections to those median futures. And I hope that today marks, a step into a new kind of realism in which we don't just think about blowing past those targets in terms of median projections, but also think a lot more seriously about, the tail risks there.
Let me draw that out for one more question, then I want to come to Alice. So first of all, we're stipulating in this panel that we're going to blow through the climate targets. Let's say we're in a 3-degree world. As you said, David, 2 degrees really freaked us out. Now we're in a 3-degree world. And then let me ask you, based on what you just said, what are the risks at the 10 or 20% potential likelihood level that, just to give some kind of comparator, is like our naive estimate of whether Donald Trump would have been elected in 2016, right? That probability chance, 10 or 20%. What does that mean for the American homeland?
Well, I think it means that the American homeland will not be dealing with 3 degrees of warming. It'll be dealing with something like, especially on land, which is warmer than the planet as a whole, something far north of there. And that means that it pulls back into play a lot of the things that have been long described as somewhat worst case scenario projections. So when we talk about 4 or 5 degrees, the effect on crops will be probably quite significant. The effect on heat-related stress and heat illness will be quite dramatic on economic productivity. All of these things are nonlinear stories, which means that going up by 1 degree isn't just doesn't make things just 50% worse than they would be at 2 degrees. It could be considerably worse than that. And I think we also have, unfortunately, much less science about those future warming levels than we have at some of these lower levels, which we're not going to be living with. And I think that the big picture is not as important. I feel like it's less important to focus on particular projections, particular models, and more just to reckon with the deep uncertainty about the way the future will unfold and how different parts of the country will be affected. And I think about something like the LA fires that we saw at the beginning of this year. These are not narrowly a climate event, but they are made more likely by climate change. And they were a scale of devastation that most Californians, even those quite accustomed to life with fire, recognize as something like unimaginable. And yet already, whatever it is 3 months later, they're already part of the background noise of the way that we think about the new world that we're living in. And I think that dynamic is going to play out on many levels in many places in the decades to come, whether we're dealing with 2 degrees, 3 degrees, or 4 degrees of warming. We're going to be constantly confronted with things we believed were unthinkable, and then very quickly normalizing them so that we don't even see clearly how many disjunctures we've ourselves lived through.
I want to go to Alice now and come back to a conversation we were having in the small room before this conversation, we talked about the Congressional Budget Office's projection of a 6% hit to American GDP in the baseline case. And let's assume here our baseline case is 3 degrees of warming or worse. That seems manageable. The hit to property insurance, it's painful for all of us. We all are paying a few extra $1,000s, but it seems manageable. Alice, step us forward a decade, 2 decades, the second half of the century. In a 3 degrees world, is the United States inhabitable? How does this compare to other foreign policy threats we often talk about here at the Council on Foreign Relations? A tactical nuclear weapon striking a city. Give us some imagery.
Well, the short answer, there will be places in the United States that will be habitable. I don't think that the United States will disappear off the map. But, and I am very excited to be here for the climate realism and have a chance to talk about what's ahead. And to David's point, the modeling here is very difficult for us to grasp. I see an old friend here, Rafe Pomerantz, and a colleague, I don't know how to say that, Mike, but, and we wrote an article about how 1.5 degrees is just meaningless to most people. They cannot figure out whether it's Fahrenheit. I lived in LA for a long time, 1.5 degrees, that's a normal day. That's how we live. Why do I need to worry about that? So we've through the climate negotiations, and we needed a default to hang our hats on, we used that, but it turns out it does not resonate with the public. And with this, as we've been talking about, it needs imagination, because by definition, what we experience with climate change is the unimaginable. These are events that no human societies have experienced at this level of ferocity, and that will continue as we get hotter. That's very difficult, as it turns out, the social scientists will tell us, for humans to accurately calculate. And that's why we talk about medians. We talk about 2100. There's also a delay in the time that these will unfold. So we are very occupied with our immediate problems. And then to your point on related international threats, with climate change, there's no one pushing a button. There's no one who's going to say, I want a nuclear strike. Let's wipe out this, or we're going to have a release of a pathogen from a lab, or we're not going to vaccinate people. It's just going to happen. And that's very difficult to rally and marshal political will to address it, because the causes of it feel attenuated, and we are highly dependent on one of the primary causes, energy from fossil fuels, so that gets discounted. And I will also say that the economic modeling, I'm not an economist by training, but intuitively, the economic modeling on this seems to me to be way off. And I'll leave you with an example. William Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize for Economics for his early modeling of the costs of climate change. Very important work. He was really trying to get at the issue, how much will this cost GDP if we continue to heat up? And what you're trying to do with that is balance how much heat can we tolerate as a society, and in the meantime we'll be growing wealthier, and that will help us be able to tolerate this heat. Through the work of other economists, they dug into the models. And of course, all models rely on assumptions. That's just the way they work. And we don't have a computer that can pull in all the factors that climate change affects. He was looking at heat. He looked at outside workers in the United States, the hit to workers in the United States to GDP from heat. He concluded that because 87% of our GDP was generated from work that occurred indoors, mining and offices, that we really didn't need to worry about heat. And of course, that meant he projected a lower loss to GDP. Of course, people have pointed out, heat affects our infrastructure. You see that we can't transmit electricity as efficiently when there are hot conditions. We can't cool the nuclear plants. We can't run hydropower. It affects public health. Your workers aren't going to be able to show up. They've been bitten by a tick-borne disease. They've got problems with heat and respiratory issues from the pollution. Then we can move on to factors that kids don't learn as well in school. And so that affects our long-term workforce. You just can't model all these factors, but then we pick this number that gives us confidence that we've got this under control, and we are using the median levels. And we're not, as you've said, Varun, looking at the massive tail risks. And to the report that David mentioned, one of the tail risks is tipping points. So at 2 degrees, and this really frightens people, we lose most of the world's coral reefs. Now, if you're a scuba diver, that's really important. But for us, some of us are like, what's the big deal? Well, over 1 billion people in the world rely on fish for protein. Our marine ecology is highly dependent on coral reefs. They're very important for tourism, and they're just very important for the health of the oceans. But at 2 degrees, which we all acknowledge we are highly likely to blow past, we're going to see that. Now, we've got some exciting things. I read today in the paper in Florida, they're sinking a ship to create an artificial coral reef. So, yeah, that's cool. But we are not doing anything on the level of scale to deal with the kind of transformational change that is already underway. And that's why it's so important to try to figure out ways to help people understand this risk and then make better choices today that will keep all of us safer in the future.
Thanks, Alice. I want to first I want to crystallize this and come to Sherry. Look, this panel is all about how would we act differently if we just assumed we were headed for 3 degrees. And it starts with acknowledging that a 3-degree world poses a grave national security threat to the United States homeland on the same level as some of the major other foreign policy threats that this CFR community considers, from global terrorism. Alice, you mentioned a global pandemic. Alice, you also mentioned decisions that folks take to put their finger on a button to launch a missile. This is one of those major grave threats. Sherry, I want to come to you as we pivot to, so what do we do about this? You have been just such an important figure in the climate and security community. And I'd love to hear from you, if the United States were to assume we are headed for this extraordinarily grim future, how do we prepare at home and abroad? And ideally, how do we position ourselves for advantage in an evolving geopolitical landscape in areas such as the Arctic?
Okay, just a small question there, Varun. Okay, first I want to thank Mike for his leadership here at the Council on Foreign Relations and for really taking this on. Mike and I were law school classmates, and really this is so important, and I'm so grateful for your framing this. And Varun, there couldn't be a better leader on this than you. So you're really turning a new chapter now in climate and security, and David and Alice, thank you very much. And to so many of you in the room and online here, I know many of you have been working in and around this field for many years now, and your work is invaluable, and I want to herald it, and I want to say it continues to be vitally important. Climate as a national security risk came into view about 20 years ago now. The first group of generals and admirals to assess the national security implications of climate change through the Military Advisory Board at CNA in 2007 characterized climate change as a threat multiplier. The title also of my book, Climate, Military Leadership and the Fight for Global Security. And at the time, we understood that to be leading to instability in volatile regions of the world and maybe have impact on the homeland. I would say, now we're leading to a world where we're going to flip that, because we're going to have as much impact here on the homeland as instability around the world. Now, at the time, we looked at it through the lens of the catastrophic risk we faced during the Cold War, which was the threat of nuclear annihilation by the Soviet Union, and we talked about that as a low probability but high consequence risk, which was worth investing billions of Americans' GDP to defend and deter. Climate change, of course, as we now know, is both a high probability and now, as we've heard, a very high consequence risk, particularly as we're heading now into a 3-degree world. I think there were those in the climate community 20 years ago who thought that the national security assessments of climate change would lead to more action than we have seen, and we're still on the way to a 3-degree world, and I'd say so the urgency now is in many ways even greater. As we look at what could happen both at our homeland, which includes the Arctic, we are an Arctic nation, and as we look around the world, and Varun, you ask about the Arctic. So, in the Arctic, temperatures are rising more than 4 degrees, the global average. So we're already at that, many ways, that 3-degree C world. We see rising temperatures, sea ice retreating and melting, and we see a whole new ocean that's really opened in our lifetimes. We see Russia that wants to transform the Northern Sea Route into a toll road for transportation from ports in Asia to ports in Europe. China also eyeing the Polar Silk Road and ambitions not only for transport energy, but perhaps in the future fish, as fish stocks move more towards the poles with warmer temperatures and over and illegal fishing elsewhere around the world. And we have our own Arctic in Alaska, in which we have underinvested, with claims of maybe having other parts of the Arctic at the same time. Well, so we're heading into a world now of more tension, more disruption that is in part climate-driven, in part driven by the new geopolitics of focusing on minerals and energy resources and descending into spheres of influence. We have been on a path of having climate-informed decision-making throughout our national security structure. The assessments still continue to be valid, even if they are not as widely recognized or prioritized in this administration. And what deeply, I'd say, concerns me is that without having climate-informed decision-making, we will not be prepared and ready for the next level of climate disruption that is inevitably going to face us. So, for example, we track through the Center for Climate and Security through something called the Military Response to Climate Hazards Tracker, the number of times that militaries are deploying in response to fires, floods, hurricanes, other climate-driven hazards. And in the last year, it was 240 military deployments around the world, from fires in Greece to floods in Spain, with 113 times in the United States alone. So that means that we are responding to those climate threats that face Americans. Think of Hurricanes Milton and Helene, the fires in California. Increasingly, our National Guard and our active duty forces have to be the backup response to our emergency first responders. And so we find now ourselves where we could be in the future faced not only with a Superstorm Sandy in New York or devastating floods and hurricanes in the Southeast, but all of these cascading risks occurring at potentially overlapping each other. The Texas grid outage, the fires in California. So we could have multiple and cascading risks that really stress the ability of our infrastructure, our human infrastructure, as well as our military response to be prepared. And nonetheless, our forces have to be ready to deploy around the world. And China, for example, is still very much aware. They're taking advantage, for example, of the opportunity that's been created by the discord in global climate negotiations to actually fill some of those vacuums around the world and provide that humanitarian assistance and disaster relief that has traditionally been provided by American forces.
Thank you, Sherry. And just to let everyone know, in a couple minutes, we are going to go to questions from the audience. So I urge you to think about what you'd like to ask. But let me just ask a couple more as we get particularly provocative. I'll try and make these rapid-fire lightning round ones The first one is, Sherry, you talked a lot about the race for geopolitical advantage in the reshaping Arctic in front of our eyes. Setting aside for a moment whether the annexation of Greenland would be a blow to the international rules-based order and an unmitigated disaster for our alliances, setting that aside, what would that do for America's race for geopolitical advantage in the Arctic?
Well, on the one hand, you look at Greenland, and it is part, if you look at the map, it is clearly part of the North American continent. Some have said, my colleague, the director of the Polar Institute, Rebecca Pincus, said, you know, we've got the, Alaska is the 10 and Greenland is the 2 on the North American map. So if you think in terms of spheres of influence, then it has been. And there's a history. Of course, we do have we already have a defense arrangement with Denmark and Greenland. We've had that since the end of World War II. We have a military base at Patuxent Air Force Base in the northwest of Greenland. We are providing defense against incoming missile threats, space-launched, and other space-based or air-launched threats in the region. So we do already have that base, and it is one that is important for American security. What would it provide us to have that? Well, I mean, the claims have been made about minerals and the opportunities there. And yes, the U.S. does need, in the race to the clean energy future, a more secure clean energy mineral supply chain. There are, and Greenland is interested in those economic opportunities. First of all, there are a lot of challenges economically in developing that, in Greenland. And second of all, I don't know that in itself would solve America's challenges. I should also note that having had the privilege of going to Greenland last summer to be on the front lines of the changing climate, because you see vividly, you hear and feel, you experience that the great Greenland ice sheet, which could, along with the melting of the Antarctic ice sheets, produce feet of sea level rise that will threaten global cities in our lifetime. It is really the front lines of climate change. When you go to see the glacier, you can no longer get right onto the glacier because where the helicopter lands, the glacier has already receded so much. And in fact, it's more complicated to navigate along the coastal regions, which is how you get around in Greenland. It only has a few miles of actual roads. Most of it you travel along the coastline. And there's actually more ice in the waterways now as the great Greenland ice sheet melts and releases more ice into it. So I think that, it's important to recognize where it stands geographically and also to recognize the security that we already have through our presence in Greenland.
I would just say very briefly, I think it also illustrates powerfully. Sometimes we talk about geopolitics over here, climate over here. Sometimes we worry about the ways in which geopolitics are undermining our action on climate, but this also illustrates the way that climate change changes geopolitical considerations, that we may well not be talking about this prospect of the U.S. thinking about taking over Greenland if it were not for what climate change has in store for the Arctic. I think just big picture is something to keep in mind.
It's a good point, David.
It's a fantastic point. And that's going to bring me to my second lightning-ish question before we go to
we'll do a little better
questions. And Alice, I'm particularly thinking of you, although David, you may also want to weigh in here. So let's stipulate, for the sake of argument, that the United States is able to prepare domestically. I know it's hard to domestically prepare, as we've heard. If every other week you have an LA wildfire-size event, it's as if a bomb wiped out a big part of a city, and that happens every couple weeks later this century. It's hard to prepare for that. It's hard to evacuate the state of Florida. And if you listen to, I'm going to pick on you, David Keith, later on in the session today, we'll have a discussion about, hey, what are our break glass options? And maybe we will choose not to get beyond 2 degrees of Celsius of warming by deploying technologies such as geoengineering. But stipulating, as we do in this panel, that we are headed for 3 degrees and stipulating that we solve the domestic challenges, I want to ask about the foreign policy challenges because we're here at the Council on Foreign Relations. We talked about the Arctic, Sherry. Now let's talk about hundreds of millions or billions of climate refugees. Humanitarian disasters that dwarf the United States' own domestic disasters in loss of life, if not economic damage, just because American property tends to be quite expensive. And the rise of political elements, populist parties, and difficult politics around the world as it goes up in flames. I want to ask you, Alice, first, and then come to you, David. What are the best ways for the United States to prepare for that foreign policy future with those consequences around the world?
Well, migration is typically one of the first things that's addressed, Varun, the threat of uncontrolled migration as a result of climate change. In 2023, we saw 26 million people displaced by natural hazards, and that's anticipated that that will continue. Most people stay in their home, stay near their home if they're displaced, and then they might come back. That's true in the United States and elsewhere, but eventually people do cross borders when it gets really tough. And I believe that the pressures we've seen on our southern border have been driven in part because of climate disasters in different areas. For example, Hurricane Mitch in Honduras caused a collapse in agriculture and had long-lasting implications. Gangs were able to take hold, and that pattern is reflected across the world. In Pakistan, there was massive floodings, and during that time, the government did a poor job on emergency management. The Taliban used that opportunity to recruit. During the pandemic, you might have seen that one of the cartels was stamping the picture of a cartel leader on boxes of sanitary supplies and other basic needs, sending the message, the government won't take care of you, we will in a disaster. And of course, we have heightened criminal activity as a result of people being on the move. Human trafficking is a very common occurrence. Women and girls are highly vulnerable in those moments, as are men. So we know that migration will occur. What has been the solution that most have articulated? It's the soft power solutions. It's helping people stay at home and thrive at home. And so they're not thinking they'll move. Right now, we're seeing, as you mentioned, Varun, lack of willingness to pay those countries that don't have the kind of resources that the United States and the developed world have to respond to these events. So when their population's displaced, it's more likely to be a permanent displacement. And they have far fewer resources to keep people fed, housed. So that's investments in USAID. That's investments the European Union has been a leader in this. Many countries have been a leader in this. And I believe China's Belt and Road is in part also accomplishing this. And I just want to say, my lightning round, I do not think we can safely assume that the United States will be prepared. Compared to some nations, including China and in Europe, we are not prepared. I don't think you can say we're safely prepared now for what's occurring, much less what's ahead. We have no signals that that kind of massive transformational change is underway, either by the federal government or at the state and local territorial level.
Thank you, Alice. You want to add anything, David?
Just quickly, I would say, I think you were speaking there broadly about our adaptive capacity in the U.S. and what we've done to build resilience, but just narrowly on the question of migration. I mean, I think we can all see very clearly that migration has been a hugely destabilizing political force. This is another human feedback loop, which is going to make it more difficult to adapt in the future, and we can't treat it as a silo issue. This is all very messy, and it's affecting the whole world. It concerns me, quite significantly to see the way that even relatively small migration flows have really, really destabilized many of the fundamental assumptions about liberal internationalism that I would like to have seen promoted, rather than, taking the other path, which is what so many countries are doing now.
Thank you, David. Please,
And if I could we've long thought of, and in the intelligence community understood climate change as a catalyst for conflict and included assessments of climate risk as destabilizing across borders with increasing migration flows, as Alice and Dave have just mentioned, both within countries and between countries. And so having those intelligence assessments and understanding that has been critically important for us to be prepared for those risks that are coming. And we could be entering an era where we're under-assessing those risks.
Thank you, Sherry. So with that, we're going to open up to this full house. I'm going to request that everybody say who you are, what's your name, what's your affiliation. Keep your questions really brief or I'll have to cut you off. I apologize. We're going to go first over to Noah over there. And a mic will come to you. Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Varun. I'm Noah Gordon from the Carnegie Endowment. I actually have a provocative question for my friend Varun. I appreciate the initiative and the willingness to say that 1.5 is dead. You know, we're going past it, committed infrastructure and emissions, and the reserves take us well past it. But are we excessively lowering our ambition when we jump ahead to say 3 degrees is happening? Because I think if you had done this event 10 years ago, or even when David wrote his book, the median outcome was more like 4 degrees. And we had technological progress to get us closer to 3, and now we need the political ambition we had when we decided to abolish slavery at the point of a gun or build 50,000 planes a year to defeat Nazism. So even if we stop clinging to 1.5, must we concede 3?
Look, I believe we can walk and chew gum. It is one thing to hold as your median estimate what you think is going to happen, and it's another thing to aspirationally aim for something else and to have ambitions. I fear that in the climate discourse, the 2 degrees C ambition or the 1 C extreme aspiration have been misinterpreted as realities. And I'll give you an example of why I think this is true. I did this Easter egg hunt, like crazy wild goose chase, to try and find emission scenarios and projections from now until 2100 where we didn't have the world remaining to 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees, to try and figure out just what would every country's emissions be. You'll see the results of my wild goose chase in that video. You saw the graphic. It took me weeks to find that. And the reason is because almost every researcher today does not bake in what I believe is the correct reference baseline business as usual projection. America, as we plan our foreign policy and our responses to threats, needs to focus on, first and foremost, what's my most likely outcome. And then as David and Alice and Sherry have mentioned, there are tails on both sides. There's a tail on one side that says we go to 4, 5, 6, 7 degrees. That's really bad. And there's a tail on the other side that says maybe there's a tiny, tiny percent chance that we get to 1.5 or 2%, 2 degrees, and let's do everything we can. Look, I've spent my career in clean energy trying to get there. But climate realism is all about being realistic. That's why we're talking in this panel, I think for the first time, about how should the United States do a major wargaming exercise, just as we did in the Cold War, we did for nuclear war, we do for pandemics. Let's do a major wargaming exercise for a 3 degrees future and how we secure advantage. Thanks, Noah. All right, we're going to go over here, sir, and then we'll go over there to the left.
Thank you. My name is Rafe Pomerantz. It's always good to have friends on the panel, you know. We've talked about some of this, but I wanted to raise an issue that I have to say I've been in the climate field for decades, and I'm truly sitting here shocked by the assumption that we have to examine 3 degrees. I don't think it's wrong, but having some knowledge of the implications of 3 degrees sort of goes right through me. And I mean, we're talking about return to paleoclimate epic, you know, with the loss of the ice sheets and so on. Anyway, I'm part of an effort to create a second metric. I'd like to know what the panel thinks of this. As you said, the temperature metric has not really succeeded sufficiently in motivating the world. Now, will another metric do that? Our idea is to create a second metric of an upper limit to sea level rise, which would force governments to declare where they stand on this. How high are you willing to let it go? Which is better tied to local impacts. Now, another element of this has shown up, which is the Greenland piece. I would argue the real U.S. security issue in Greenland is the fate of the ice sheet. The ice sheet has 23 feet of sea level once it goes, and I think at 3 degrees would be well past the tipping point for that. So what about a second metric? Is that a valuable idea to introduce? Now, Alice and I did quite a bit of work on this, and but I'd like to see what the panel thinks. Thank you.
Who wants to take this first?
I'm all for more metrics. What I would worry about with an upper limit for sea level rise is just that there's so much scientific uncertainty about that. So what it means in terms of what it requires of us would be hugely ambiguous and maybe more confusing than clarifying.
Yeah, and
Well, no surprise, I support having a variety of metrics, and I think sea level rise for coastal nations is a particularly salient one because you can visualize that easily. Part of this is we just need to have some way for people to visualize what this looks like. Heat is harder to visualize other than showing people who are, prone and tired and with water lacking. So I'm in support of it.
Sherry, do you want to come in?
Well, Rafe, I think, I don't disagree with anything that's been said here, but if you're talking about sort of mobilizing, global opinion and action around that, and we look back on the reflection of what's happened over the last decade or more, where it hasn't, that hasn't enabled us as a planet, as a society, to really move the needle on it. I think, there's nothing wrong with it, but we need a lot of other action and decision-making to focus on resilience and adaptation and then as well.
We're going to go over here to the left.
Frances Flannery, BioEarth. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for forming this. Since it's the launch, I wanted to look at some of the assumptions that are built in to make sure I'm hearing it correctly. And I'm wondering, I'm going to jump on the 3 degrees isn't that realistic bandwagon by pointing to the IPCC 6th report, which of course was issued before the United States has pulled out of the Paris Climate Treaty again, et cetera. And so that's already a quite conservative report. And I want to ask about the dangers of using language like, how do we avoid catastrophic climate change when there's already 1 billion people on the planet suffering water scarcity already for part of the year? We're in catastrophic effects of climate change, and that's why the IPCC report changed, which I think is still the gold standard, even though it takes forever to come out. But they've changed their language, and they no longer speak about the possibility of avoiding catastrophic climate change. They speak in terms of securing a survivable future for most of humanity. And I think that is important because when we speak about how do we avoid tipping points without acknowledging tipping points are happening now, they're already starting and underway, and they lead to other tipping points. 3 degrees is quite, I think, conservative. And also, we're not even talking about the far end of the century. We're talking about hitting 2 degrees, which we once considered to be catastrophic, in about 25 years. That's something I think even, my college students can understand. And so, really quickly, as part of that, my question is another assumption. And I do recognize I'm at the Council on Foreign Relations and that America's positioning is at the core of CFR's mission. But I question, and I would just raise the question, since climate change knows no borders, and this is an unprecedented event in our history as a species, since some think tanks think we're even at risk of surviving till the end of the century as a species, most of us, that is, given all of that, it's going to take unprecedented cooperation like we've never experienced before. So my question is, can systems that have as their center self-interest and even negotiated national self-interest, like at the COP meetings, can this work to avoid disaster for most people on the planet in time? Or do we need to rethink the paradigm?
That's a fantastic question. I have lots of thoughts, but I want to invite our panelists to come in first if anyone wants to jump in on that.
I would just underline what you said at the start, which is that we are already living in a world in which many people are burdened in really profound ways. Many societies are under extreme pressure because of these factors. So yeah, there's no avoiding that. And I do worry similarly that to something that I think Noah was talking about earlier, just that the bullet pointing of these futures does allow us to kind of segment different scenarios that are, it's probably a misleading way. But I don't want to speak for Varun or the initiative here, but it would seem to me that the project is to try to pull those blinders off and just try to see the world a little more cleanly. And one of the things that, at least for a moment, focusing on 3 degrees helps us do is to put aside a lot of the sort of small debates we've had about 1.5 and 2 and ask us to think more expansively about what a much warmer world requires of us at whatever level of warming that is.
Yeah. Were you going to jump in?
I would agree. It's put into question certainly the international climate negotiations. And certainly the turn in our nation to isolationism is affecting, I believe, what the outcome will be with regard to climate change. But I will say that collective action does have promise. Sherry and I have been familiar with efforts, for example, at NATO to bake in strategic consideration of climate change into their planning in a way more systematic way than the United States military has, at least publicly. And also that we've seen the EU continuing to step up and promise that it will take climate action. Agreed. A little shaky, but certainly better than what's occurring here in the United States. And we saw that many countries haven't submitted their nationally determined contributions as required under the climate accords. Those were due in February, and there's many, many nations still with those commitments outstanding. We've made a commitment at the United States, but unlikely we will honor that. It was made by a prior administration. So yes, real questions. The issue is we don't have a better alternative. We may see that insurance companies will be sending us a signal. Property insurance, probably at a 3 to 4 degree world, I've been told by a reinsurer, will not be available. It's just, that isn't an insurable risk at a price anyone's willing to pay. And so we'll see corporations moving out. We will see also far more activity in our courts. We are already seeing that. Climate litigation has exploded in the last 5 years.
And just to slightly repeat maybe or underscore something you were saying, it's not an either or here. So we're not talking about choosing a path of global climate governance versus total national self-interest.
Yes.
We're living in that messy middle as we are on so many of these other questions. Yeah. And we want to push things in one direction, but it's not a binary choice.
I would agree.
I'll say just 3 quick things. First, Rafe first said, oh my God, 3 degrees, unthinkable. And then Francis, you said 3 degrees, too conservative. I think we're probably doing something right here, which is making the assumption that we're headed for at least 3 degrees is the correct way for America to correctly conceptualize the risks we face going forward. The second thing I'll say is, when I originally pitched this panel, the 3 pillars to Shannon here, our head of studies, Shannon said, I don't get it. Panel number 1 seems pretty bad. What do you mean by pillar 3 is averting catastrophic climate change? Same question you asked, Francis. I struggled with the superlatives. The 3 degree future is pretty darn bad, and preventing 4, 5, 6, and 7 is also absolutely imperative. So that's what I mean when I say we're navigating blowing through targets in panel 1 and in pillar 1. And in panel 3 and pillar 3 of the Climate Realism Initiative, we're averting the absolute apocalypse. Maybe I could have used that. Don't use that, okay. Don't use that one, okay. And then the last thing I'll say to you is you've asked a perfect question, which is, does a politics of national self-interest make sense for solving climate change? Later in panel 3, this is my 3rd advertisement for staying all the way through to panel 3. Panel 3, you're going to hear David Victor, who is a deep expert on this subject, professor of international relations, talk about why the incentives may actually shift. I don't want to speak for him, but they may actually shift from a prisoner's dilemma game in game theory to a different kind of game, an assurance game, or for those of you in the parlance, the stag hunt game. I am a dismal cynic, though, and my personal belief is national interest is the correct lens to view this. Climate realism does not make a moral claim that that is the correct moral way to look at this. It makes the positivist claim that we are in fact in a world where countries will act in their self-interest, and the realist way for American foreign policymakers to confront that world is to assume India and Saudi Arabia are after their own interests, and they may be wise to follow their own self-interest based on what American voters want. It's the world we're in. We have room for just 1, maybe 2 lightning questions. I'm going to go to the gentleman right here in the front.
Michael Gefeller, I'm on the board of directors of an AI company called Potentia Analytics, and my question is this: is it realistic to be planning, as we are right now in the United States and in India and China, for a dramatic expansion of the AI universe while confronting climate change at the same time? Because nothing increases demand for electric power as much as AI expansion does, as long as we stick to the current paradigm of using large language models running neural networks. It's incredibly intensive in terms of calculation density and in terms of power demand. Can we do both at the same time, square the climate change circle and have a dramatic expansion of AI, especially in places like China and India, where the additional power is going to have to come from coal-fired power plants. Thank you.
Literally my favorite topic to discuss. Who wants to take this up?
Well, Varun, I know you're also an expert on that, but first of all, AI and everything, we're going to be doing that regardless of how we power it. So there are going to be ways, of course, we're thinking about adding new nuclear, cleaner energy source. We're thinking about optimization. Varun is an expert on, on that. He can speak to that. I also think we have to, we talk a lot about AI in various sectors of society now and in energy. I think we also have to talk about it in and understand how it's going to be useful in climate and weather prediction, because there it's going to be very useful, and we need to be able to integrate that into our science-based advances in understanding what you might call extended weather, subseasonal forecasting, and improved climate prediction in the 6 to 1 year time frame.
We've actually got a lot of questions, so I'm going to hold my own tongue. We'll take these two together. So, yep, and then we'll do a quick final round, and we'll close the session.
I'm Eileen O'Connor, and I'm actually on the board of the Earth Public Information Campaign. And I want to ask you, from a fundamental point of view, how shouldn't we start by talking about the politicization of science and how badly that is? How do we solve that first? And don't we need to solve that first in order to even get the public to recognize the science behind climate change? And how do we get policymakers? We've just defunded NOAA, NIH, the climate section of that. What do we do on that?
Eileen, thank you. Okay, and then one more, and then that's the last question we can take.
Thank you. Makani Tungara Dell. A big incentive for businesses to get on board is regulatory. So when the SEC was weighing Scope 1 and 2 and 3 declarations in the 10Ks, that got a lot of companies on board in terms of concerns about greenwashing and doing more to decarbonize their businesses. So what would you want to see from a regulatory point of view, probably not in the United States, that would create that incentive in light of some of the retrenchment that's happening domestically?
Thank you. Let's do politicization of science, if anyone wants to take it, and then we'll quickly do regulatory as well, but that'll be the next panel as well.
Sure. The politicization of science, very serious here in the United States, in my opinion, and the departure of terrific scientists. I was the beneficiary of those scientists. I was formerly a judge. I got an assignment when I came to DHS to work on climate change. I was educated by scientists from the Navy, meteorologists from NOAA, from NASA. We have some of the finest climate scientists in the world. We have informed the IPCC reports, which we've heard are the gold standard. And now some of those people are losing their jobs, they're losing funding, and the universities that support all that effort is also losing that science. I don't think necessarily that science will not occur. I think some of those people will go elsewhere. We're already seeing that China, the EU, and others, Canada, are interested in benefiting from that because that's fueled our innovation here in the United States. So that is a loss to us. And actually, I just say, I think similarly, the neglect of regulation here in the United States means we're ceding that to the EU and Japan and other regulatory regimes. And so our multinational corporations that operate here will be answering to those regimes, whereas typically we're the standard setters in the world, but we will not be on that issue for ESG. So to me, it's just a further loss of our international power.
Any lightning responses either on regulatory needs or politicization to David and Sherry?
I'll just say quickly about politicization. I mean, I worry about it an enormous amount as well, but I do think it's worth keeping in mind that while other countries are not dealing with quite the same issues that we are on that front, very few are racing towards decarbonization at the speed that I think some of us on this panel would like. And so we have to think about the problem set there as bigger than just misinformation.
Okay, fantastic. We are at time. Quickly, I'm going to give some instructions. We're going to break. Please network. Enjoy the refreshments. We'll see you back here at 1:45, and don't be late because Secretary Ernie Moniz and Mary Louise Kelly of NPR are going to be doing the keynote fireside chat. And from there, we'll continue on with the following two panels. Again, on how America competes in the emerging transition, and then finally, how do we avert, not apocalypse, Francis, but cataclysm. With that, we're off with a bang. Thank you, everybody, for joining the launch today.